So the purpose of this video is to give you a little overview of the anaerobic versus aerobic energy production systems. Okay, we're going to look at a few different concepts today, including the ATP synthesis cycle and how we use ATP to produce kinetic movement. So if you remember from our previous video, energy can be considered as chemical, which is the foods that we eat, which fats, proteins and carbohydrates provide us with chemical energy. That chemical energy is then stored and becomes potential energy, which is energy that we can use. And when we use that potential stored energy, it becomes kinetic, so it is movement, okay? And that's that kinetic energy that becomes movement. So the purpose of this video is to explore the concept of kinetic movement and ATP and how we use ATP to produce kinetic movement. So ATP is really the key to all movement. It's used whether we're doing anaerobic or aerobic exercise, and we're going to talk about the differences between those in a minute. But let's just have a little look at what happens and how we use ATP in our body. So when you consume food, so we have our food down here, it could be your fats, protein or carbohydrates. It is stored in our body as energy. Remember, that's our potential energy. And when we go to move and produce movement, we want to have kinetic movement, we need to use ATP. When you have ATP, and ATP is adenosine triphosphate. The tri here gives you a little clue in that it is 3. So our adenosine triphosphate, we have adenosine molecule and 3 phosphates attached to that adenosine. So it is adenosine and triphosphate, so 3 phosphate molecules attached there as well. Okay, so that's just important to know when we're looking at adenosine triphosphate. When you have an adenosine triphosphate molecule, APP, so the ATP, what happens when we want to produce movement, our bodies break off that 3rd phosphate molecule. When that molecule is broken off, it releases energy. So we release that energy, and when we release the energy, our bodies are able to produce kinetic movement. Okay, so that release of energy provides us with muscle activity, which is our movement or our kinetic movement. So then you might be thinking, well, what happens after this? So let's just have a little look, and we have a little ATP-ADP cycle here, okay? After that little molecule is broken up here and release of energy, we then have an APP and a free phosphate molecule. This here is called ADP. And so that ADP is adenosine diphosphate, okay, which, as you can see, is the adenosine molecule and 2 phosphate molecules now, okay. And what our bodies can do with the ADP and the ATP, they can form those again, which creates the ATP, so that we can use that to release energy again. And it works in a little cycle, so we'll break down, release energy, and then our body will form an ADP molecule with a phosphate molecule to provide ATP to the body again, and it will work in that cycle so that we can continue to produce muscle activity over here. Okay. The ways in which our body accesses the ATP and synthesizes ATP can be done in two ways. It can either be anaerobic, okay, or aerobic. The key is anaerobic. Key thing to remember when you're considering these two terms is that anaerobic is without oxygen, so without O2, oxygen, and aerobic is with oxygen. So when we are accessing the ATP and synthesizing ATP aerobically, we're using oxygen for that. And any anaerobic movement will be any movement that lasts typically for less than 30 seconds, okay? And we're going to explore that when we look at energy systems further down the course as to why those movements will only last typically around 30 seconds. Aerobic movements is any movement that is longer than 30 seconds. So movements that are longer than 30 seconds. We start to use oxygen to synthesize that ATP. And just briefly, the reason why we need to be able to produce anaerobic movement without oxygen is that when you start to move, your brain signals that our muscles need oxygen, but it takes time for our body to pump enough oxygen around our body. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for that oxygen to make its way down to our muscles for movement, we need to be able to use anaerobic movement, an anaerobic synthesis of ATP, to be able to produce that kinetic movement. So what I want you to do, just to test your understanding of this, is select a sport and then pick 3 actions associated with that sport. So then with those actions, I want you to try and determine whether they are anaerobic or aerobic actions, okay? So think back to that previous slide where I talked about how long movements last. So think about the intensity of the activity and how long it lasts, how long that movement lasts for. So if you were looking at soccer and dribbling the ball the length of the field around defenders, how long does that last for? And would it be predominantly anaerobic or aerobic movement?